Conference
This
is no
conference will now be recorded.
This conference will now be recorded. um, and so being able to really talk about kind of that cultural comprehension aspect, competence versus comprehension, talking about vulnerabilities within the LGBTQ plus community. And then finally, we're going to talk about, not just challenges and faced in providing services and treatment, but also how you as members of youth service bureaus, as individuals who work with youth, can work to help create safe spaces and accessible spaces, and also strengthen relationships within the LGBTQ plus community in your own counties. So with that, just kind of talking competence versus comprehension, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the term cultural competence. Most social service agencies that work and cater towards youth strive to be culturally competent, right? It's that idea of being able to identify different barriers or vulnerabilities that people might experience. And as you can see on the slide here, we have the original definition of what cultural and linguistic competence is. What we do within the working group and within this training, what we're really striving to do is elevate from cultural competence to cultural comprehension. The reason for this is because competence, as you can see from this definition, in all aspects is a good thing, right? And I think we have a couple people on the phone, so just to make sure, we're all able to hear the same thing. Cultural competence is a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or amongst professionals, and enables that system, agency, or those professionals to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. And that's the original definition from 1989. Now, on paper, this is fantastic, right? We look at this and we go, absolutely, this is what we should be striving for. Where we have seen the gap, however, is what is done to enact a culturally competent setting within a workplace, within an agency. And oftentimes what this looks like is hiring an individual, bringing on an employee that is bilingual, right? Most often we see cultural competence kind of addressing language barriers and individuals who are maybe foreign nationals, or maybe English is not their first language. So having someone on staff that can provide interpretive translation services, which again is fantastic. There's nothing wrong with that per se. When we talk about the gap of competence versus comprehension, a quote that comes to mind from Daniel Dennett is, "Competence without comprehension is essentially to make a perfect and beautiful machine, but it is not requisite to know how to make it." The gap exists when competence only goes so far as to say, we recognize we might be working with members of a community that has trouble communicating in English. They're not comfortable speaking in English. They don't speak English, so we need to bring someone on who can communicate with them. Comprehension takes that understanding and says it recognizes the barriers and vulnerabilities that someone is going to experience, but is going to actively work to address and remove those barriers. That's cultural comprehension. And as we talk about that in the mindset and the mind frame of, well, what about the LGBTQ plus community, right? I said a couple minutes ago, Happy Pride. It's June. June for a lot of states throughout the country, and a lot of other countries as well. June is what we call Pride Month, and this is the month where a lot of organizations and agencies will participate in Pride festivities, right, which is LGBTQ plus Pride. Indianapolis hosts typically what we call Indy Pride, and it's days of parades and festivals in the parks in Indianapolis. When we're talking about competence versus comprehension, the model I always like to use, the example I always like to use, is the way we address Indy Pride. Cultural competence would essentially be, oh, Pride is a celebration, that it's okay to be gay, it's okay to be LGBTQ plus. Good for you. Go enjoy your day in Military Park in Indianapolis. which, thank you, don't get me wrong. We had a great time with Lizzo when she came and did a concert in Military Park last year. But the understanding of what pride is for stops there with cultural competence. Cultural comprehension, again, is that next step. And what that does is it says, pride is not a celebration per se of being gay, of being LGBTQ+, but rather pride is a celebration that LGBTQ+ people can no longer be arrested, be criminalized, and be institutionalized for their sexual orientation or gender identity. So just to kind of give you an idea of what I mean when I say competence versus comprehension, especially with it being Pride Month, that's one of the ways that we can definitely see that kind of that gap, and hopefully give you an idea of what we can be doing to mend that, to bridge that gap. And when we talk about a culturally comprehensive program, we always kind of address key components, right? Recognizing diversity. Again, it's being able to recognize diversity, recognize different elements that someone is going to experience, and it's going to impact their lived experience, but recognizing diversity and also striving for inclusion, taking an anti-oppression approach, recognizing the social detriments of health. When we talk about that, we have to understand that certain life experiences can and do have a profound impact on our ability to stay healthy and access the health system, right? And these absolutely include things like poverty, discrimination, level of literacy, cultural, linguistic barriers, homelessness, job security. And each and every one of these is going to have an impact on the youth that we serve. And with each kind of stacked social detriment that they experience, that's going to be essentially another block that could prevent them from safely and healthily accessing services and resources. So ultimately, we want to, and aiming for equity, right? Ultimately, what we want to do in a culturally comprehensive program is recognize diversity, be able to acknowledge the barriers, the vulnerabilities that different people are going to experience in their life based on their lived experience, and actively work to remove those barriers so that way individuals have access to resources and services. Now, if you've seen this presentation before, or you can see we have a new image here on the slide. A lot of times when we talk about equality versus equity, we see the image of the three young people standing on boxes outside of a fence of, I believe it's like a baseball field, trying to see over the fence and see the game. But over time, just like most things over time, our understanding evolves, right? And so one of the things that we're seeing change is the understanding and the kind of graphic representation of inequality, equality, equity, and ultimately justice. So if you're able to see the slide, you might recognize this. I believe it's from the Giving Tree, and they've kind of redone the image a little bit to show kind of why we're striving for cultural comprehension and equity versus justice. So inequality, right, is unequal access to opportunities versus equality, which is typically what you hear places striving for, right? Marriage equality, and that's evenly distributed tools and assistance. Again, on paper, that sounds fantastic. But when we're talking about, right, competence versus comprehension, we're also talking about equality versus equity. Equality essentially means the same, right, evenly. The barrier essentially within that understanding and stopping there, equality versus equity, is not everyone is going to be able to access, in this image, the tree just because they're given the same size ladder, right? That's what you see as being tools and assistance, is you have someone who didn't have a ladder, now they've been put on a ladder. But clearly you can see the ladder still doesn't reach the tree. So the same access to tools and assistance doesn't work for everybody, versus equity, which is custom tools that identify and address inequalities, right? So you can see the person on the side of the tree that's leaning, they're standing on the opposite side of where the tree is leaning, so they're still having trouble accessing it with that equal ladder. They've been given a larger ladder. And now the conversation, and think about it in the context of what we're seeing happen throughout the country right now with protests, right? Going from equity to justice. And justice is ultimately fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. And when we talk about this in the context of the LGBTQ plus community, and understanding what things look like in the LGBTQ plus community, especially when we talk about equality versus equity, right, which is evenly distributed versus custom tools that identify and address inequality. When we talk about the way that the LGBTQ plus community is able to access services, that looks very different for different people, for different sexual orientations and gender identity. What I mean by that is, I always, kind of make the decision to do this whenever I do this training. As a gay woman, I have certainly experienced barriers in my life. However, as a 6 foot tall white woman who is fairly feminine presenting when I choose to be, my ability to access and safely navigate systems looks very, very different than someone who is maybe non-binary or gender non-conforming. Someone who is trans, they're going to have a very different experience in life, their ability to safely navigate services. And considering it is June, it is Pride Month, I would be doing a major disservice to the LGBTQ plus community if I did not talk about the fact that the most vulnerable population within the LGBTQ plus community has always been and is still Black trans women. They are the most vulnerable to things like violent hate crimes and homicide, right? They have the highest rates of homicide within the LGBTQ plus community, but also the least access to resources. So they have the largest barriers. So when we're looking at the model of equality versus equity versus justice, all of this is absolutely relevant and prevalent within the LGBTQ plus community. And let me say, please, if you have questions as we go, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you're also welcome to unmute yourself. I know this is being recorded, but I believe there's about 26 of us, so it's a small enough group. You're more than welcome to unmute if that's easier than typing in the chat, or if you're having issues with the chat function. Please, I encourage you, ask questions. That's why I'm here. We're talking about things that maybe you've not sat through a conversation like this before, so I encourage you to ask questions and ask for clarification if you do need it. As we take that understanding of competence versus comprehension and begin to apply it to working with LGBTQ plus individuals, specifically LGBTQ plus youth, there's a couple of things we kind of have to go over, which in some ways this is just foundation language. I'm sure you're all familiar with some form of the acronym LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQ+, LGBTQIA. I get this all the time. I don't know which one to use. When in doubt, just add a plus at the end. You cannot go wrong if you add a plus at the end. So that means you can do LGBTQ+. The plus is inclusive. That's what it's for, is to say we acknowledge that there are additional letters within the acronym. We acknowledge and understand that there, the spectrum of gender identity and sexual orientation is vast. So the plus just means we're inclusive. We recognize and acknowledge that it goes beyond just LGBTQ. So you can't go wrong if you add the plus at the end. But one of the most kind of comprehensive acronyms we're using right now is LGBTQIA, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual. I won't spend too much time going over all these, what the different letters mean and the definitions of each, but I always like to hit on language, because language changes, right? The acronym has evolved over time and continues to evolve. But it's important, especially when it comes to potentially working with LGBTQ plus youth in your community and in your role, to understand the way some of this language has evolved and has changed. Specifically, right, when we think about things like the term transgender. At this time, that is the most politically correct term. What I mean by that is, in the past, terms like transvestite, tranny, those have been used. Those are derogatory terms at this time. So we use the term transgender, but we don't pluralize this word. We don't say transgenders. We don't say someone is transgendered. It is transgender people, transgender individuals. So that's just kind of an updated lingo. And then to intersex. For years, this term was referred to as hermaphrodite. We don't use that term anymore. We use intersex. Intersex is an individual with ambiguous genitalia. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And there's specific vulnerabilities that intersex individuals experience. So again, this is just kind of updated language, just so you're aware of what these mean. And then queer. Queer is a big one, and quite frankly, queer is a touchy subject. For a lot of people in the LGBTQ plus community, queer has always been and will always be a derogatory term. For some younger millennials and Gen Zers, they are kind of working to reclaim the word queer and see that as being more inclusive. Queer is essentially seen as an umbrella term, as an all-inclusive term. It recognizes not just gender identity or sexual orientation, but also lived experience and the different things that can impact somebody's life in the process of understanding their gender identity or sexual orientation, but also in addition to their gender identity and sexual orientation. Now, with that being said, I want to make you aware of that term, but then I also have to add, please do not use this term if you are not within the LGBTQ plus community. This is absolutely a term that is used within the community, and it's very specific for people who are comfortable identifying and using that term. So if after today you're catching up with friends or loved ones and they ask you what you did today, feel free to say, oh, I attended an LGBTQ plus cultural comprehension training. Please don't say I attended the queer training. Not good. We cannot use the term like that, right? So that's just understanding competence versus comprehension, understanding the impact that language has, especially within this community. So I like to make you aware of it, but then also make sure you understand this is kind of an internal term. I do not ever recommend using this unless you are explicitly asked by somebody to use that term if that is their comfort level. But with that in mind, do you have any other questions about the acronym right now, or would you like me to clarify anything? You can either put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask. No? All right. So just kind of building on that and the acronym, right? Kind of just talking a little bit about commonly misunderstood definitions. Gender identity versus sex. So sex, biological, what you have, what you're born with. So that is essentially right, male, female, or intersex. Love that. Mystery arm pops through and I appear with coffee. Thank you. It's a fantastic day. Now I can start my day. I have coffee. Right, and so sex, biological, what you have, what you're born with, right? Male, female, intersex. Versus gender identity, which is what you feel. So if you've ever heard the term cisgender or the term transgender, just to provide some clarification, cisgender by definition just means you identify the gender you identify with matches the biological sex with which you were born. I was born female, I identify female, thus I am a cisgender female. Versus an individual who is transgender, which just means their gender identity does not match the biological sex with which they were born. If you have someone who is biologically born male, but they identify as female, transgender female. Now, there is a lot of debate about the validity of the transgender identity. And let me be very clear. There is enough research out there to show that transgender individuals, their brain and the way their brain responds best matches the gender with which they identify and not the biological sex with which they were born, which means if you have someone who is biologically born male, but they identify as female, if you were to do a test and scan their brain, you would find their brain matches that of a biologically born female, a cisgender female, and vice versa. So the idea that you wake up one day and you choose, which is an incredibly offensive idea to begin with, that's been disproven. Actually, there's been science and research that has been done that has disproven and shown that that's a myth. It's brain chemistry. It has to do with the inner workings of the brain. And then in addition to cisgender and transgender, you also have, again, intersex, but non-binary, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, agender, genderqueer. Do not worry, there will not be a test at the end of this. But just to get you understanding that we've essentially existed in an idea, in a society that tells us male or female, masculine or feminine, and in reality, the gender identity continuum, life exists on a spectrum, it exists on a continuum. There is no such thing as just, cisgender and transgender, nor has there ever been. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. And then getting into, you can never assume a person's gender identity or sexual orientation on their appearance. Most often you see this associated with the term gaydar. You can tell someone is LGBTQ+ based on some clues they give off. I can tell you gaydar is really just an offensive term that means that it's based off of offensive stereotyping. Because gender expression, again, is a continuum. Feminine, masculine, androgynous. And then when we're talking about sexual orientation, there's not just gay, lesbian, and bisexual. There's also asexual, pansexual, queer. All of those are different things which someone might identify with, and they might identify that as being their orientation. And I keep talking about this continuum, and this is what I mean. Life does not exist in a binary. Life is not black or white. It never has been. Sex has never existed, right, as just male or female. Intersex individuals have always existed. We just haven't talked about it. Gender identity, right? So when I talk about that binary, what I mean is an individual who is born male, they identify as a man, their gender expression is masculine, and their sexual orientation is heterosexual, attracted to women. Then you have the other side, female, woman, feminine, attracted to men. And in reality, life has always existed on a continuum. We just at some point in time decided that the binary was right, and that's what we were comfortable with because it's easier to be able to look at someone and be able to categorize them, right? Our brain does that to try and allow us to navigate conversations, navigate social situations. But that's essentially a learned behavior. We should not be trying to guess the gender of somebody or based on their gender expression, be able to say what their sexual orientation is. It's not how it works. And in reality, when we talk about things like gender identity, right, man, woman, but you also have transgender, genderqueer, gender expression, you have masculine versus feminine, but you also have androgynous, someone who doesn't necessarily conform to either. And when we talk about gender expression in that binary, keep in mind, when we talk about feminine, we talk about the really, girly, pinks and purples and yellows. And when we talk about masculine, we talk about blues and strong colors. And in reality, that in itself was switched. Pink used to be a masculine color, blue used to be a feminine color, and then one day someone decided we're gonna flip it, and we went with it. And that has impacted our ability to interact with kids from a very young age. And if you have boys who play with Barbies, it becomes this big thing. But that in itself can lead to a very different conversation about the social expectations of children, which that's not what this training is about, but right, that idea of a boy cannot play with Barbies, but a girl can play with Hot Wheels. And right, the idea of tomboy, which we'll talk about in a little bit, we'll touch on in a little bit. But I want to show you this this image so that way you can understand when I say life exists on a continuum, especially gender identity and sexual orientation, this is what I mean. And talking about and getting into specific vulnerabilities of LGBTQ plus youth in the LGBTQ plus community, we know we see lack of acceptance by family, by peers, by their community, difficulty finding placement for queer youth in foster care. I can tell you, Katie Roche and I, when we kind of developed this as a cultural comprehension training, we rolled this out at the end of April last year. So we've only been doing this training for 14 months, not even 14 months actually. And we've on multiple occasions had DCS, CASA, guardian ad litems come up to us afterwards and say, hey, this was great information, which, you know, this is very kind of them to say, but we have a 13-year-old trans girl on our caseload right now. There's not a single foster family in my community that will take her. There's not a single family in my county that I can safely place her with. This is a very real thing that we're experiencing. There is not a single LGBTQ plus drop-in emergency center throughout the entire state, which means if you have kids who cannot be safely placed because they are LGBTQ plus, where do you send them? Do they sleep in the DCS office? Or do you put them with a family that you know isn't safe for them, but it ensures that they're gonna have a bed that night? And I can tell you right now, if you put them and they're placed with a family that does not understand and does not accept, we're talking about intense, prolonged, life-altering trauma. No access to informed healthcare, lack of inclusive sex education. When we're talking specifically about the LGBTQ plus community in Indiana, I can tell you that in February 2020, so right before all the, you know, the shelter in place and we started experiencing COVID-19 here, to the point where we were doing shelter in place and travel restrictions, in February of 2020, Indiana Youth Group served over 250 homeless LGBTQ plus youth, and they offer programming and resources to youth ages 12 to 20. So in 1 month, they served over 250 homeless LGBTQ plus youth. Because if they're not safe at home and you can't put them in a safe family in foster care, where are they gonna go? And no access to informed healthcare and lack of inclusive sex education. And what I mean by that is, I think we can all acknowledge and accept that Indiana does not have the most inclusive or even accessible like sex ed in schools, right? And when they do have it, parents can opt out and they can say that their kids don't have to attend it. But we also have to acknowledge and accept that sex ed is typically heterosexual. It is specifically talking about relationships between boys and girls, men and women. The only time you hear anything related to LGBTQ plus information specifically relates to STDs and HIV/AIDS. We do not talk about same-sex relationships in sex education, which means, and even when we're talking about heterosexual youth, if they're not getting the information at home, if they're not getting the information in class, what happens when they have questions that no one can answer? They're going to Google it. Now, doesn't mean they're not going to end up on a porn site, let's be very honest, but there are definitely resources out there for heterosexual youth to access to answer their questions. But what do you think happens when you type gay sex into Google? You're going to see nothing but porn, and oftentimes very violent porn. So that is going to impact a youth's ability to navigate healthy and safe relationships. So that has a lasting impact. When we're talking about specific vulnerabilities within different populations in the LGBTQ plus community, right, we see boys and men, gay, bisexual, and queer or questioning boys and men. We see increased rates of bullying and hate crimes. They're stereotyped as overly sexual or inviting sexual contact all of the time. Their first sexual experiences in education often take place online, and it is not uncommon for older men to reach out to vulnerable, quote unquote, closet gays to offer advice, teaching, or sex ed, and will unfortunately take advantage of their naivete. Certainly not all, but it is common enough that we need to address it. We're talking about youth who are displaced from their homes, and we also are battling the myth that rape cannot happen to men. Now, it's highly unlikely that you're going to encounter youth that has only experienced one of these. Most often when we're kind of talking about these vulnerabilities within the community, for boys versus for girls, for trans individuals, we're often talking about overlapping barriers, but also they're checking multiple boxes. So this might look like a young man who is called every derogatory name in the book, and bullied at school, and then as soon as the bell rings, he has like half the football team texting him, asking if he wants to hook up. And that's a real story from an individual who I've known for many years, and he gave me permission to talk about that. But that's what it looks like, because if you have this idea that all gay, bisexual, or queer and questioning boys are inviting sexual contact all of the time, that means they become essentially an experiment to people, and they can be used and abused that way. So that absolutely impacts somebody's ability to navigate what a healthy and safe relationship is going to look like. And that's also going to impact their ability to navigate resources and services. When we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer or questioning girls and women, we see the ideas of corrective sex. We definitely see fetishism. There's this kind of overarching idea that lesbians exist for male pleasure, same-sex domestic violence and the fear of seeking help, bullying and harassment, and being misunderstood, right? That idea of you're just a tomboy, we all love our friends. Now, when we talk about, there's a lot of things we can talk about, and I have to keep in mind we only have an hour. So when we talk about things like fetishism, the idea that lesbians exist for male pleasure, a lot of people learn this again from porn. But we also see things like corrective sex, and we can kind of break down corrective sex into two forms. And in the first one, there's subcategories. So the first one we see as corrective sex being both an internal experience and kind of an outward experience. So when I say outward, that's kind of like the outside influence that people have, which is one night with me and you won't be gay anymore. I can fix you. And I'll stop there because it gets a lot more graphic, and we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. However, but that is the outside message, which is it's a phase and it's an experience, and with the right person, someone can fix you. Someone can make you quote unquote normal, which in this case means straight. Because we do live in a heteronormative society where straight is the predominant existence. A heterosexual relationship is the right relationship, right? So, which obviously that's not correct, but that is what we see. That's what we're told that's existing within that binary. So that outward pressure, and then when it gets to be enough, or you live with enough internalized homophobia, and there's enough kind of this outside pressure, that flips to the internalized, which is, and that internalized corrective sex is, okay, everyone's telling me that if I just engage in a sex act with someone of the opposite sex, I can be normal. So that not only do you have that outside pressure, but then you internalize that, and then that turns into someone engaging in a sex act with someone of the opposite sex to try and correct themselves. That says, if I can just get through this, I can be normal. I can exist safely in a heteronormative society. And ultimately that causes not just psychological trauma, but that can also cause long-lasting physical trauma as well, if that's something you know that you don't want to participate in, but you feel you have to do it to correct yourself, to essentially course correct your sexual orientation. And then the other thing we see, because I said there's kind of two facets of that corrective sex. So we have the internalized and we have the kind of outside influence. And then the other side of that, we actually see corrective marriage, which is someone who will get married to someone of the opposite sex and live this life to live a quote unquote normal life, to live a safe life. And if after everything we're talking about today, you are kind of curious as to what does that look like for someone to navigate a same-sex relationship, if they can't be out, I highly recommend the documentary A Secret Love on Netflix, which actually directly follows follows an elderly lesbian couple who have been together since, I think they've been together for over 60 years when the documentary began filming. So they were navigating life when it was still illegal to be LGBTQ+. And then we also know, right, when we talk about outside influences for both boys and men and girls and women, we also know that social media and the way that LGBTQ+ relationships are portrayed in TV and movie is going to have a profound impact. And if we had more time, I would talk kind of about the dangers of that and the trauma that we see, because there is such thing as it's called the bury your gays trope, which is shows and movies will bring in LGBTQ+ characters for the purpose of killing them off. That's a whole next time on my TED talk. We'll address the bury your gays trope, but that's a very, very real thing, and it has a profound impact, and it traumatizes people, so that way they do not feel they can safely exist in their, in their society. And talking about trans individuals, again, like I said earlier, we're talking about brutal violence and hate crimes. That's a whole different aspect of fetishism, interrelational violence and strangers. May have unique physical and sexual needs, and may be particularly vulnerable, additionally vulnerable if they're unable to access hormones from a doctor, and difficulty finding housing, employment, proper health care. So the first thing I want to say on this slide is Indiana does not have LGBTQ+ hate crime laws, which means hate crimes can be committed against LGBTQ+ individuals, and in the state of Indiana, it's not a hate crime. Our laws do not protect LGBTQ+ people. And then in addition to that, I'm going to take my first sip of coffee, so give me just a second. In addition to that, that also means Indiana is a state, I think it's called an at-will state, which means someone can absolutely be denied housing, be denied employment, or be fired, and be denied access to health care because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. That is a thing that does exist in Indiana. And if we have questions about that, just keep in mind that we also had the law that was passed that said businesses can discriminate against LGBTQ+ individuals, right? So that is kind of the overarching theme that we have in the state, and we have for quite some time. But trans individuals face a lot of vulnerabilities. Their ability to even express their gender identity, to come to terms with that, to be able to safely kind of experience that, and then think about what that looks like for dating. They have to make a decision to disclose that every time they're in a situation where they may want to engage in a sex act with someone, right? And they have to figure out how they're going to disclose that. And keep in mind, and just to be very, very honest, please keep in mind that the way our laws work is if we're talking about someone who's engaging in a sex act with someone who is trans, and they say, I'm not comfortable using this body part because of things like gender dysphoria, and they haven't been able to have the surgery, whether that's because they can't access a doctor, they don't have the insurance for it, whatever the reason may be, but they still have that biological part, and they say, we can engage in sex, but I don't want you to use that part, someone can say okay and then begin to violate them during the sex act. The reason I bring that up is because in the state of Indiana, we don't have a law that states that that is rape, but it is. If you have someone who has explicitly said, I'm not comfortable with you doing that, and that their partner then does that, they've taken advantage. They have committed a sex crime against that person, and our laws do not reflect that in Indiana. And then additionally vulnerable if unable to access hormones from a doctor. That's a whole conversation about somebody's ability to connect with a doctor who can prescribe hormones, who can continue to prescribe hormones. What does that look like if you have someone who's on hormones when they're still a minor, but then when they turn 18, how can they access a doctor who will continue to prescribe them hormones? There's a whole network within the LGBTQ plus community to be able to make referrals like that, so that way someone is able to access their hormones. If they cannot get to a doctor though, and they need those hormones, where are they going to get them? Because I can tell you, they will get them. And it's a matter of being able to access them when they've been safely prescribed versus potentially having to access them on the street, which is a very real thing that we see here. And then talking about intersex individuals, corrective surgery. So again, intersex, so someone who is potentially born with ambiguous genitalia. When we see that corrective surgery, we most often see that corrective surgery happening at birth. And just to be very clear, the decision will be made and can be made. And it can be based off of just how small does a penis have to be when a child is born for a doctor to come in and say this child should be raised as a female. That is part of the conversation. But that's really for newborns. What happens when you have individuals who are being raised as female, and then when they hit puberty, testes drop, or you have girls who are individuals who are being raised as female, and then when they hit puberty, their period doesn't come, and they get taken to a doctor, and they find out that they actually don't have a uterus because they are intersex. There's a lot of things that happen where doctors have conversations with parents, and decisions are made on that child's behalf without that child knowing, because typically when corrective surgery happens, the parents are told, don't ever tell your child. And so that can lead to a lot of misgendering, and that can lead to mental health issues, that can lead to dysphoria. They're often lied to by both doctors and parents, and the decision has been made for them, and ultimately they may identify as transgender or queer, but they've kind of had a very monumental aspect of their life stripped from them without the ability to contribute to that conversation. So getting into just some statistics and talking about prevalence, we know that there have been some studies that have been done that have shown anywhere from 5 to 20% of your clients are gay, lesbian, or bisexual. 1 to 10% of your clients are transgender. And when we do talk about intersex individuals, we actually know that it is 1 to 2 in every 2,000 newborns have ambiguous genitalia, which percentage-wise, that's actually the same percentage as natural-born redheads. But when was the last time you heard about intersex being taught, the topic of an intersex individual being taught during sex ed? Have you heard of intersex like support groups? And the answer is they don't exist. We don't talk about it, despite the fact that it's like 2% of the population that live as intersex. And then there was a study done in 2017 that surveyed youth in juvenile justice facilities, and it found that 20% of all youth in juvenile justice facilities identified as LGBTQ, and of the LGBTQ and gender nonconforming youth in those juvenile justice facilities, 85% are youth of color. So talking about that inequality, equality, equity versus justice, this is where that conversation can come into play amongst different places, but this is definitely a place to be having that conversation. Inequality, equality, equity versus justice. And then when we're talking about prejudice and discrimination, one national study reported that an average of 34% of LGBTQ plus individuals experience rejection by family, the highest percentage being lesbians at 50%, gay men at 32%, and bisexual individuals at 26%. 75% of LGBTQ plus individuals report prejudice or discrimination, and 32% have been targets of physical violence to their person and or their property. But we know that youth on the streets are going to report higher rates. When it comes to mental health, LGBTQ plus individuals are almost 3 times more likely than others to experience a mental health condition such as major depression or generalized anxiety disorder. And we have to talk about LGBTQ plus youth and suicide. We know that QPR, right, question, persuade, refer, the suicide prevention training tells us that when it comes to suicide attempts, there are approximately 25 attempts for each documented death, and typically in order to document a death as being a completed suicide, it is because a note has been left behind. But if we know that there are an average of 25 attempts for each documented death, that means that for the 47,000 suicides we see annually, that translates to 1.2 million attempts each year. And then we know that number when it comes to LGBTQ plus youth, that number is high. We know that LGBTQ plus youth are 3 times more likely to contemplate suicide than heterosexual youth. They are almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide compared to heterosexual youth. Of all suicide attempts made by youth, LGBTQ plus youth suicide attempts were almost 5 times as likely to require medical treatment than those of heterosexual youth. Suicide attempts by LGBTQ plus youth and questioning youth are 4 to 6 times more likely to result in injury, poisoning, or overdose that does require treatment from a doctor or nurse. In a national study, 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt, and 92% of them reported having attempted suicide before the age of 25. And then we know that LGBTQ plus youth who come from highly rejecting families are 8.4 times as likely to have attempted suicide as their LGBTQ plus peers who reported no or low levels of family rejection. I think it is also important to say that when it comes to things like suicidal ideation and attempts within the LGBTQ plus community, the Trevor Project tells us that having one supportive adult in a child's life, so one supportive adult in an LGBTQ plus kiddo's life, can reduce their suicidal ideation by up to 40%. One person that tells them that they are valid, that they are seen, that they are a real person can reduce suicidal ideation and attempts by up to 40%. So what are you doing to be that person? And vulnerabilities from a service provider standpoint, we know there's absolutely physical and psychological threats or harm, the feeling of isolation or being ostracized, rejection by family, by friends, by their school or religious affiliation, name calling, and self-hatred. These are all additional vulnerabilities from what we talked about of just vulnerabilities of being LGBTQ plus. When it comes from a service provider standpoint, these are some of the additional things you're going to see. And we know that these issues can put youth at a higher risk for homelessness. And there's estimates that LGBTQ plus youth comprise 20 to 40% of homeless youth. What I can tell you is in the state of Indiana, 1 in 4, so 25% of LGBTQ plus youth will be thrown out of their homes when they come out. 25% of LGBTQ plus youth will be thrown out of their homes in the state of Indiana when they come out. And if they're lucky, they have a friend's couch that they can crash on. If they're not lucky, we're going to be seeing those rates of homelessness. We know we see definitely increased rates of substance abuse in the LGBTQ plus community, increased rates of self-harm and exploitation. Now, because we are short on time, don't really have time to go into a lot of information about the federal definition of sex trafficking of a minor as it relates to the LGBTQ plus community. But what I will hit on is if you're familiar with the federal definition of sex trafficking of a minor, I want to also make you aware of the definition of survival sex. Now, there is no federal definition or state definition for survival sex. This is a definition that is developed by my co-creator, Katie Roche, right? Survival sex is circumstantially forced sex work engaged in by a person because of their extreme need. It describes the practice of people who are homeless or otherwise disadvantaged in society, trading sex for food, a place to sleep, other basic needs, or drugs. Survival sex is very prevalent in the LGBTQ plus community because when you have kiddos that have nowhere to go and no one that is going to take care of them, it unfortunately can become a part of their culture. I cannot tell you the amount of times after doing this presentation in the last year that I have had people come up to me and disclose that when they were young, they engaged in survival sex to be able to pay for food, to be able to pay for a jacket, to be able to ensure that they didn't sleep on the street that night. It becomes normalized for the homeless LGBTQ plus youth. The reason I bring this up is because when we're talking about agencies like DCS, DCS operates under the federal definition of sex trafficking of a minor versus the state definition, which like our police departments are going to operate under, which is state definition says for sex trafficking of a minor, there needs to be a third-party facilitator. Federal definition does not require a third-party facilitator, which means anyone under the age of 18 who is engaging in commercial sexual conduct can be identified as a victim of sex trafficking under the federal definition. So you, as youth workers, if you are working with individuals, with minors who are engaging in survival sex, under the federal definition, they can be identified as a victim of sex trafficking, which can open the door to a whole new list of service providers and resources. So that's all I really have time to say about it here, but just please be aware that is a possibility, that is an option when we're talking about survival sex of youth. And then when we're talking about overlapping barriers, we know that there are many barriers to exiting trafficking that are the same factors that lead individuals to engaging in survival sex, and that's everything from financial dependence and addictions, desperation, manipulation, not being believed, fear of police. So talking about building comprehensive based services, we can kind of break this up into three elements: creating intentional invitations, advocacy, and referrals. Language. We know language is powerful. Words and language is powerful in both the positive and the negative. We operate a lot of our navigation is led by things like language, which is why you have people who are LGBTQ who won't come out when they're young because they know based on the language that they hear, they know it's not safe for them to disclose. So with that in mind, some youth self-identify. If you're working with a youth who identifies as LGBTQ+, use their words. Which means if you have a youth who identifies as queer, use queer. If you need to include that in conversation because that is how they identify. But don't use the term queer if they're not identifying with that because they're not comfortable with that. And that can put up a barrier of them being able to feel like they can safely communicate. Language changes often, go with the flow and get comfortable with your words. That's also being comfortable with being uncomfortable, which we'll talk about in a little bit more in just a moment. But know that language changes. So it's with that in mind, it's absolutely okay to make mistakes. If you make a mistake, acknowledge it, correct it, and move on, but don't dwell on it. When I say language changes often, really quickly, let's talk about pronouns. Pronouns, I've had a couple people tell me that they've seen pronouns as being essentially kind of a quiet way to self-identify as being LGBTQ+. If you have someone that introduces themselves with their pronouns, they're essentially saying, I might identify somewhere within the LGBTQ+ community. And that's kind of a myth. That's not really correct. By utilizing your pronouns, you are telling the people around you, especially clients, that by acknowledging your own pronouns, if they can come to you and tell you their pronouns, which means if you have in your email signature or somewhere on your desk, somewhere accessible, that they can see that, you utilize pronouns, what that tells them is they can come to you, and if they identify with pronouns such as they, them, or if you have someone who you would look at and believe that they are female, but they are utilizing he, him pronouns, by disclosing yours, you let them know, I'm going to respect your pronouns. That's all it is. But that's a change in language. And so getting comfortable with the fact that it does change. Ask when you don't know what something means, ask for clarification, but always confront name calling and bullying. What I mean by that is if you have youth who are self-identifying, but they're using derogatory terminology to refer to themselves, they might be experiencing either internalized homophobia, which comes in the form of essentially a self-hatred, which is very common. They may also be testing you to see what you're going to do and if you're going to confront a derogatory term. So be comfortable with confronting it, asking why they feel the need to use that, and figuring out if there's different language you can use. Attitude and willingness, right? We live in a heteronormative society. We have, heterosexist assumptions. What I mean by that is assuming. Okay, I can kind of give you this little tidbit. When my wife and I were planning our wedding, we went to taste testing for our caterer. We went to florists, we went to photographers, we went to makeup artists. And heterosexist assumption is that when you have two women who come in for an appointment, you have a bride and her bridesmaid instead of two brides. That's a very specific example, but it's very easy to, if that's all you know, to fall into that and to assume you're talking to best friends or, in my case, a bride and her bridesmaid. Society exists in a hetero kind of normative assumption. So what can we do to kind of break that mold? Historical distrust and impact of isms, right? Sexism, racism, knowing your values and your biases, readiness and timing on their part, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. You have to keep in mind that the LGBTQ plus community are asked invasive and oftentimes traumatizing questions on a regular basis. If you ask, what happened to you? What made you this way? How did you know? Those can all reopen wounds. It can trigger somebody and they can absolutely backpedal and no longer feel comfortable in your space. So just being okay, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, asking when you don't know what something means, but also being able to address your own biases and things that you've maybe not thought about before. I know we are out of time. Okay. So do you want me to just really, really quickly go through these last couple?
If you just just show them, and then because I do have to start the other session too.
Okay. So physical environment, right? What do you have in your space to show that you are open and affirming? Effective advocacy, your policies, your procedures. Do you have a gender neutral bathroom? Do your intake forms only have female or male? That's a quick fix. Just put gender and leave it blank, let them fill it in. Put pronouns, let them fill in their pronouns. And looking for blind spots, educating those around you. Effective advocacy, conversion therapy programs. We bring this up because Indiana still ranks as one of the leading states in the entire country that participates in conversion therapy programs, and we know 57% of transgender and gender non-conforming youth will attempt suicide within 12 months of being put in a conversion therapy program. And again, we are one of the leading states. It is harmful. It will cause lifelong trauma. And then your professional network. Do you know of LGBTQ plus community centers? Do you know who in the state of Indiana is providing services and resources for referrals for LGBTQ plus people? And if you don't, you're welcome to contact me. That's what the LGBTQ plus working group is for. That's what we do. And again, we sit on the IPATH task force. So I apologize, we kind of had to skip through a couple slides here at the end. But if you have questions, please feel free to contact me and ask. If you would like to know what services exist in your area, what LGBTQ plus agencies or organizations are working in your area, please feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to connect you with the people that I know. With
Thanks.
that, thank you so much. And I see the question, will I share the PowerPoint? Absolutely, this is a shareable PowerPoint. Because of email space, it'll probably have to come to you as a PDF, but I will make sure, Robin, if you can track who all was attending today, I can make sure you all get a version of the PowerPoint, probably in PDF format. Yeah.
Thank you.